As we have mentioned ever since his passing on July 17th, the late Congressman and civil rights icon John Lewis, he has touched countless lives. In a moment, we're going to share another one of those connections. But first, we take a look. This live pictures as there is a viewing line outside of the Capitol. Yesterday, Lewis's casket was taken through Washington, visiting the Lincoln Memorial and Black Lives Matter Plaza. Lewis made one of his final public appearances there just a few weeks ago. Of course, Lewis's role in Bloody Sunday in Selma, Alabama has been widely covered since his passing. But Lewis also gave an impassioned speech on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial during the March on Washington in 1963. That event and Lewis's address worried the then President John F. Kennedy and his Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy. As it turns out, Lewis and RFK would form a bond, so much so that Lewis was in the building the night that Kennedy was assassinated. And after Lewis passed, RFK's daughter, Kerry Kennedy, called Lewis her hero. To learn more about that connection and how Lewis became her hero, we turn now to Kerry Kennedy herself. She's not only the daughter of Robert F. Kennedy, she's also the president of the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Advocacy Group, of which the late John Lewis was a board member. Thank you so much for the time. I really appreciate it, Kerry.
Great to be with you, Richard.
You know, I read in a story that in the late Congressman's office, there was a prominently featured photo of your brother and also a bust of him. The two were very close, weren't they?
Yeah, you know, my father was Attorney General of the United States at the time of the Civil Rights Movement, and John Lewis, who of course was the leader of that movement in the freedom rides, in the walk across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, in the SNCC protests in Maryland, and so many other ways. And they really worked closely together. It was I work in human rights internationally, and it was such an interesting relationship because the Black civil rights activists were being repressed and oppressed by local governments, governors, mayors, chiefs of police, and my father was using the power of the federal government to come to their aid. And John told a bus full of Kennedy grandchildren once, you know, I don't know that I would be alive today if it weren't for Bobby Kennedy.
And vice versa, he changed your father's view of race in terms of the urgency, I understand it, of civil rights, and that it couldn't be so incremental. It needed to be more dramatic and need to be now. He was really awed by the courage of John Lewis, particularly, you know, in a nonviolent way, but yet putting his life out there.
Well, there was no group of people my father admired more than the Freedom Riders. They were 15 Black and white young people who got on Greyhound buses and rode across the South in 1961. And they were challenging the Jim Crow laws that were illegal under the U.S. Constitution, mandating bathrooms or lunch counters be separate for Blacks and whites. And they were mauled, they were beaten, and my father was awed by their courage. But after one of the protests, and at a different time, in 1963, the summer of 63, John Lewis came to my dad's office at the Justice Department. And my father said, you know, I've learned from the young people. I've learned from you, John. John Lewis was 22 years old. I mean, it's hard to imagine Bill Barr meeting with a group of protesters for the Black Lives Movement and saying, I've learned from him.
Unimaginable after the hearings today that could happen. But so I knew different parts of a story, but I never knew they had come together. And that is, we've played here on the anniversary of Dr. King's death, the moment where your father, then campaigning for president, had touched down in Indianapolis, and it happened to be the day that Dr. King was assassinated. The then mayor of Indianapolis, Dick Lugar, who would go on to be senator, apparently told your dad, listen, You can't go out and speak in inner city Indianapolis tonight, and I can't send my cops in to protect you. I never knew, but he picked up the phone and he called John Lewis, who was there, and said, what do I do? He said, they're your people, go out. And I want to play a clip from what your late dad said the night that Dr. King was assassinated to an inner city group in Indianapolis.
I can also feel in my own heart the same kind of feeling. I had a member of my family killed, but he was killed by a white man. What we need in the United States is not division. What we need in the United States is not hatred. What we need in the United States is not violence and lawlessness, but is love and wisdom and compassion toward one another.
And there wasn't rioting that night when there was in so many other cities. I had no idea until I read it that the connection between the late congressman and your father, even on that day.
Well, you know, Daddy asked John Lewis to help him when he started the first community development bank in the United States in Bedford-Stuyvesant, Brooklyn. And then a couple of years later, that was about 1966, and then 68, when Daddy ran for president, he asked John to come and help organize the Black community. And as part of that, John went to Indianapolis and actually organized that rally. So I think that was a very special moment. You know, Daddy was able to connect to that crowd, not because of the beauty of his words that night, even though they were really beautiful and touching and compassionate, but because he had worked with that community for so long, and he had worked in Black communities across our country for the last 8 years, and he had he had worked hand in glove with John Lewis. So there was a trust there, and there was a knowledge there. And then John, after Indiana, went out to California and organized the Black community in California for my dad. Cesar Chavez was organizing the Latinx community for Daddy. And then John and Cesar together went door to door in white communities. So, I mean, I just cannot imagine opening my door and having Cesar Chavez and John Lewis there saying, will you please vote for this presidential candidate? But that's what happened.
Obviously, you've dedicated your professional life to human rights, and you had said if it would be more than fitting if the Pettus Bridge, considering who it's named after now, would be renamed for the late congressman, particularly, obviously, Bloody Sunday and everything else. You hopeful that might happen?
I think it will. I think there's a tremendous amount of interest in that. And I think, you know, John gave his entire life to civil rights and to peace and justice in our country. And there couldn't be a more fitting tribute to somebody who had his skull knocked open on Bloody Sunday because of his peaceful protest, when he was instructing people in that protest to kneel down and pray. He was on his knees kneeling down when those white supremacist police officers came and beat him, bloodied him, and nearly killed him. And I think that his sacrifice for our country for basic civil rights would well be served by that honor.
Well, we certainly appreciate you giving us some time and taking us through your family's connection with the late congressman. Thank you so much, Kerry Kennedy, for the time.
Thank you.
And when we come back, we turn our attention to COVID. And we're going to be joined by senior White House correspondent for ABC News, Cecilia Vega. She and others at ABC have a special coming up tonight, Catastrophe. How did we get here? Taking a look at the run-up to where we are with COVID and also a look ahead. It's a fascinating special. We'll have our conversation with her next.